Cowboy watched Apache forced to kneel, and the distant horn announced what none expected. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Jake Thompson, a rugged cowboy, had lived most of his life on a small, isolated ranch at the edge of the frontier. With the endless stretches of desert to his back and the harsh winds of the mountains to his front, he had made peace with solitude. His only company was the wind, the occasional stray animal, and the memory of a tragic past that still clung to him like dust. Jake had once been a part of something larger, but those days were long gone. His family, his friends, his entire world had been swept away in a brutal raid years ago. Since then, he had chosen to keep to himself. That was until today. Today, something was different. As Jake was repairing a fence, his eyes caught a glimpse of a small group approaching from the distance. The group was led by a man, and behind him, a woman was being forced forward, her hands bound and her head lowered in shame. It wasn't just any woman. This was Ayanna, a member of the Apache tribe, and she was being forced to kneel before the men who had captured her. Her eyes were defiant, but her posture was one of submission, forced by the harsh circumstances she found herself in. Jake stood frozen, unable to move as the scene unfolded before him. His heart raced as he recalled the long-standing tensions between the settlers and the native tribes. But this was different. He had seen these kinds of confrontations before, but this one hit differently. There was something about Ayanna's strength, even in the face of such humiliation, that stirred something deep within Jake. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but he hesitated. He knew better than to get involved. His past had taught him that helping someone could often lead to disaster. But as the group continued to march forward, Jake's gaze remained fixed on Ayanna. She had a presence, something fierce in her that refused to break, even under the weight of this unjust punishment. Jake could feel the tension building in the air. The wind seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, everything went still. Just as Jake was about to turn away, something changed. A distant horn echoed across the plains, its sound deep and resonant, carrying on the wind. The noise was unmistakable, and it carried with it an ominous sense of foreboding. The men holding Ayanna froze, their attention snapped to the sound. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew what that horn meant. It wasn't a warning, it was a signal. A signal that something much larger was on the way. Ayanna's eyes, once downcast, now lifted, her expression hardening as she locked eyes with Jake from across the distance. It was as if she knew what was coming, as if she had been waiting for this moment. The wind picked up again, but this time it carried something else, the unmistakable sound of hooves. A single rider appeared on the horizon, moving slowly at first, then faster as the sound of more hooves followed. Jake squinted into the distance, his pulse quickening. The riders were coming. And with them, the reckoning that none had expected. The riders were fast approaching, and the sound of hooves grew louder with each passing second. Jake Thompson stood still, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his back. His heart pounded in his chest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something far beyond his control was unfolding before him. Ayanna, still kneeling before the men, looked up as the distant horn echoed again, this time louder, sharper, as if calling for something. Her eyes never left Jake's as the tension in the air thickened, and her lips parted slightly as if she were preparing to speak, but no words came out. The leader of the group of men holding her glanced nervously at the horizon, his hand hovering over the gun at his side. They had heard the horn too. But it wasn't the sound of any ordinary signal. It was the call of the Apache warriors, the ones who had always been the enemy, or so they thought. The wind picked up, swirling around Jake, carrying with it the scent of dust and a promise of something inevitable. He could see the figures of the riders now, clear in the sunlight. It wasn't just one man. It wasn't even a handful. The riders kept coming, more and more, until the ground beneath Jake's feet seemed to vibrate with the weight of their approach. Iona stood up suddenly, her movements graceful yet filled with a quiet defiance. The men who had been holding her looked confused, unsure of what to do now that she was no longer on her knees. But Iona's gaze never wavered from Jake. There was a strange kind of calm in her eyes, as if she had been expecting this moment. She whispered something, but the wind carried her words away before Jake could make them out. A small figure emerged from the group of riders, a young boy, no older than 12. He was riding a white horse, and though he was smaller than the others, there was something about him that demanded attention. His eyes locked with Jake's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The boy's face was serious, almost too serious for someone his age. The horse beneath him slowed as it approached, and the rest of the riders followed suit, their movements as coordinated as a well-trained army. The young boy raised his hand, signaling for the group to stop. The riders did, settling into a line behind him. Jake felt a strange sensation in his gut. The boy was no ordinary Apache warrior. He could feel it in the air, in the way the warriors moved, the way the dust settled around them like a storm waiting to break. The leader of the group, still holding Iona, stepped forward, but the young boy held up his hand. The tension between them was palpable, a silent battle of wills that neither side dared to break. For a moment, no one moved, the only sound the wind whistling through the trees. Then, the boy spoke, his voice strong for someone so young. "Release her," he commanded, his eyes never leaving the man who held Iona. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking between the boy and Iona, who was standing tall now, unbowed. The boy repeated his command, his voice carrying a weight far beyond his years. The man let go of Iona's arm reluctantly, stepping back as if unsure of what to do. Iona, free at last, stepped toward Jake, her eyes meeting his once more. There was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding that transcended words. Jake could feel his pulse racing, but he didn't know why. The boy turned his attention to Jake, his gaze unwavering. There was a strange calmness in his eyes, as if he were sizing up the cowboy, trying to decide whether he was a friend or a foe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the boy broke the silence. "You did the right thing," he said softly, his words carrying a sense of finality. Jake didn't know what to say, but he nodded slowly, acknowledging the strange truth in the boy's words. The Apache warriors, silent as ever, waited for the boy's next command. The moment felt suspended in time, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The young boy on the white horse stood still, his eyes never leaving Jake, as if weighing him. The air was thick with anticipation, the wind swirling around them, carrying the scent of earth and dust. Jake felt his heart race, his pulse quickening as the Apache warriors behind the boy remained silent, their eyes focused on him and Iona. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. The boy's voice broke the silence again, calm but firm. "You're Jake Thompson," he said, as though he had known his name all along. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected the boy to know him, yet there was no doubt in the boy's words. "Yes," Jake replied slowly, unsure of what to make of this sudden recognition. "And you're Iona's brother?" he asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. The boy nodded, his expression unreadable. "I am Dakota," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "And this is my tribe." Jake's eyes flicked to the group of Apache warriors who had followed Dakota. There were dozens of them, all watching, all waiting for something. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, and it made him uneasy. Dakota seemed to sense Jake's unease and gave him a small, knowing smile. "We do not seek trouble," Dakota said, his voice carrying an air of calm wisdom. "But we do not back down from it either." Jake stood tall, trying to steady his nerves. He had lived a life full of conflict, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving in the harsh world of the frontier. It was about something much deeper, something far beyond his control. "I didn't want any trouble," Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside him. "I've kept to myself for years. I have no interest in fighting anyone. Takota's gaze softened, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of understanding in the boy's eyes. Your heart is not cold, Jake Thompson, Takota said, his voice low and respectful. But the world is not always kind to those who choose peace. Jake nodded, his mind racing. He had always been an outsider, a man who preferred the quiet life of a rancher to the violence and conflict that often came with living in the West. But now, standing before Takota and his warriors, he realized that his quiet life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. Ayana stepped forward, her eyes meeting Jake's with a look that was both grateful and uncertain. She had been freed, but Jake could see the weight of the situation still hanging over her. They will come for us, Ayana said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. The ones who took me. They won't let this go. Takota's expression hardened, and he gave a slight nod. We will protect you, he said, his voice filled with determination. Jake looked at Ayana, then at Takota, and for the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of hope stirring in his chest. He had never wanted to be a hero, never wanted to get involved in the struggles of others. But now, standing beside Ayana and Takota, he realized that sometimes, being silent and distant was no longer an option. The time for standing by and doing nothing had passed. The sound of hooves echoed once more, closer now, and Jake turned his gaze toward the horizon. The riders were coming, and they were bringing with them the conflict that Jake had tried so hard to avoid. But now, there was no escaping it. The only choice was to face it head-on. The sound of hooves grew louder, the riders closing in with every passing second. Jake stood on the edge of the clearing, his hand gripping the rifle by his side, his body tense, waiting for whatever was to come next. Takota and his warriors remained motionless, like statues, their eyes scanning the horizon, unwavering. Ayana, standing beside Jake, seemed calm, but her eyes were alert, every muscle in her body coiled as though ready to spring into action. The riders were not alone. The group that approached had been growing in size, the dust they kicked up swirling around them, painting a picture of impending conflict. Jake's heart raced, but there was no turning back now. He had seen enough to know that this was the moment where everything would change. Takota turned his head slightly, his voice low and steady. They are not from my tribe, he said. These men are settlers, the ones who caused trouble for our people. Jake didn't need to ask more. He knew exactly what Takota meant. These were the very men who had been part of the brutal raids, the ones who had brought nothing but destruction to the Apache tribes. Takota's warriors began to shift, their eyes still focused on the riders, waiting for their leader's signal. Jake watched, uncertain of what would happen, but certain that a confrontation was inevitable. The first rider broke free from the group, his figure growing larger as he approached. He was tall, with a broad chest and a face that was as hardened as the land itself. His eyes locked with Jake's, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. This man, Jake realized, was the one who had been in charge when Ayana was captured. He had no love for the Apache, no respect for their people. The man's lips curled into a sneer, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun as he urged his horse forward. You're a long way from home, Cowboy, the man said, his voice dripping with contempt. This land is ours, and it's time for you to remember your place. Jake's grip on his rifle tightened, but he held his ground, his eyes never leaving the man. He had faced worse threats in his life, but this felt different. This was more than just a fight over land. This was about survival, about protecting something much bigger than himself. The rider pulled his horse to a stop just a few feet away, his face twisted with arrogance. You really think you can stand against us? He spat. This is our land, and we're taking it back, whether you like it or not. Jake could feel the anger rising inside him, but he kept his voice calm. I've no quarrel with you, he said. But if you come any closer, you'll find you've made a mistake. The rider's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. A mistake? He said with a laugh. The only mistake here is you thinking you can stop us. He reached for his weapon, but before he could draw it, Takota's voice rang out, clear and commanding. Enough. The single word was like a strike of thunder, and the riders froze, their eyes shifting nervously. Takota stepped forward, his warriors following him in perfect formation. There was no hesitation, no fear in their steps. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the riders knew it. Takota's gaze fell on the leader of the group, and for a moment, the two men stared each other down. The tension was thick, like the air before a storm. "This land is not yours to take," Takota said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "You do not belong here. Leave now, and we will let you go." The rider's eyes flickered with doubt, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You don't scare me," he sneered. "This is our land, and we won't be chased off by a bunch of savages." Takota's expression hardened. "You've been warned," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a finality that made the rider pause. Jake could see the man's resolve beginning to crack, his hand still hovering near his weapon, but uncertainty was creeping into his eyes. The warriors behind Takota were ready, their hands resting on their own weapons, but there was no movement. This wasn't just about force. It was about principle. It was about standing for what was right. The rider hesitated for just a moment longer before he scoffed and turned his horse around. "We'll be back," he growled, his voice full of venom. "And next time, you won't be so lucky." With that, he spurred his horse forward, and the rest of his men followed, retreating into the distance. Takota stood firm, watching them leave, but his posture didn't relax. He knew this wasn't over. The battle for the land, for the future of their people, was far from finished. But for now, they had won. Jake exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. He looked over at Ayana, who gave him a small, grateful nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that sometimes, the greatest battles were the ones you fought for others. The Apache riders began to disappear over the horizon, the last of their figures vanishing into the distance as the dust settled behind them. The tense stillness that followed felt like a breath held too long, but gradually, the air seemed to ease. Jake Thompson remained where he stood, his hand still gripping his rifle, though now it felt almost unnecessary. Takota and his warriors, however, did not relax. They were still on edge, their eyes scanning the horizon, ensuring the threat had truly passed. Ayana, standing beside Jake, took a long, slow breath, her posture still upright, though the tension in her body began to fade. Her eyes met Jake's, and for a fleeting moment, there was a silent understanding between them. No words were needed. They had shared this moment, the weight of what had just occurred heavy in the air. Takota stepped forward, his gaze still fixed on the empty landscape. "They will not be the last to come," he said, his voice steady and filled with the weight of experience. "This land is full of men who think it belongs to them." Jake nodded, his eyes still on the spot where the riders had disappeared. "I figured as much," he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of resignation. "But we've bought ourselves some time, haven't we?" Takota gave a slight nod, his eyes narrowing slightly as he surveyed the land. "Time, yes. But time is a luxury we do not have. They will come back, and when they do, we must be ready." Jake didn't respond immediately. His mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. He had never expected to get involved in anything like this, but now, standing beside Ayana and Takota, he felt a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. He had lived a life of isolation, of running from the past and keeping his head down, but now it seemed the past had caught up with him. And it had caught up with him in a way he couldn't ignore. Ayana stepped forward, her eyes still locked on the horizon where the riders had vanished. "I won't let them take it from us," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. Takota turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable, but there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "I know," he replied. "We will protect this land, just as our ancestors did." Jake could feel the weight of Ayana's words, the conviction in them that resonated deep within him. He had heard of the Apache people's strength, their resilience in the face of adversity, but he had never truly understood it until now. Ayanna wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something much larger than herself, something that transcended any single battle or skirmish. It was about honor, about heritage, about protecting everything that had come before her. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves in the distance. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Were the riders returning already? He tensed, his hand instinctively going to his rifle, but Dakota raised a hand, signaling him to wait. The sound of hooves grew louder, and soon a single rider appeared on the horizon. This time, it wasn't a group of men, but one lone figure, riding with purpose. The rider came closer, his form becoming clearer in the fading light of the day. Jake squinted, trying to make out the rider's identity, but it wasn't until the man got closer that he recognized him. It was Caleb Thornfield, the rancher from the neighboring property. Jake relaxed slightly, lowering his rifle. Caleb slowed his horse as he reached the clearing, his eyes scanning the group before he dismounted. He was a tall man, with a rugged look that spoke of years spent working the land. His face was weathered from years of sun and wind, and his eyes held a quiet intensity that Jake had always respected. "Jake," Caleb said, his voice rough but friendly. "I heard what happened. Thought I'd come by and see if you needed any help." Jake nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We're all right for now," he replied. "But I have a feeling this isn't over." Caleb's gaze flicked to Ayanna and Dakota, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. "I see. You've made some new friends," he said, though it wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Ayanna stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Caleb's. "We've come to an understanding," she said softly. Caleb looked between Jake, Ayanna, and Dakota, then nodded slowly. "Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I'll stand with you if it comes to that." Jake could see the sincerity in Caleb's eyes, the same quiet resolve that had led him to stand up against the wrongs of the world in his own way. "Thanks, Caleb," Jake said, his voice filled with quiet appreciation. "We'll need all the help we can get." Caleb gave a curt nod, then turned and mounted his horse once more. "Take care," he said before riding off into the distance, the sound of his hooves fading as he disappeared into the night. The wind carried his departure away, leaving behind a lingering sense of determination. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over. But he wasn't alone anymore. The days following Caleb Thornfield's visit were marked by a quiet tension that hung over the land. Jake Thompson, Ayanna, and Dakota spent their time preparing, gathering what supplies they could, and ensuring the ranch was ready for whatever came next. The Apache warriors remained vigilant, patrolling the land, their presence a constant reminder that the situation was far from resolved. Jake had always prided himself on keeping to himself, living a life free from conflict, but now, standing alongside Ayanna and Dakota, he realized that peace wasn't something you could hold onto forever. It was something you had to fight for. As the sun set one evening, casting the land in a golden glow, Ayanna approached Jake, her footsteps light but purposeful. She had been quiet lately, her thoughts clearly occupied with the events that were unfolding. "Do you ever wonder if it was all worth it?" Ayanna asked, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Jake glanced at her, his brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. Ayanna stopped a few paces away, her gaze distant as she looked out at the horizon. "The fighting, the bloodshed, it feels like it's never enough. Like we keep losing more than we gain." Jake took a deep breath, stepping closer to her. He had seen the determination in her eyes, the fire that burned when she spoke of her people, but now, there was a weariness in her that he hadn't noticed before. "I don't know if it's ever enough," he said quietly. "But if we don't fight, if we don't stand up for what's right, then what's the point of anything?" Ayanna's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the weight of their shared experiences seemed to bridge the gap between them. "I've spent my life fighting for my people, for my land," she said, her voice steady now. "But sometimes I wonder if it's enough." Dakota appeared from the shadows, his presence commanding yet calm. He looked between Jake and Ayanna, his gaze steady, as if he had been listening to their conversation from the beginning. "It is enough," he said simply. "The fight is never easy, but it is necessary. If we do not stand firm, if we do not protect what is ours, then we lose everything." Jake nodded, taking in Takota's words. He had always admired the Apache's strength, but now, standing alongside them, he realized just how much strength it took to endure the constant struggle. As the days turned into weeks, the group continued their preparations. The riders from the neighboring settlements had not returned, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they did. The quiet had a way of making him uneasy, and each creak of the barn or rustle of the wind seemed to remind him that danger was never far away. One morning, as Jake worked on repairing a section of the fence, Takota approached him, his expression unreadable. "The time is near," Takota said, his voice low and steady. Jake paused, his hands resting on the wood. "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart picking up the pace. Takota's eyes never left him as he spoke. "We have prepared as much as we can. Now we wait for them to come. When they do, we will be ready." Jake nodded, the weight of Takota's words settling in his chest. It was a quiet warning, a reminder that they couldn't avoid what was coming forever. That evening, as the sun began to set, Jake sat outside his cabin, looking out at the land that he had come to call home. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the cool breeze carrying the scent of sagebrush and earth. Ayana joined him, sitting quietly beside him as they both watched the fading light. "Do you ever think about the future?" Ayana asked, her voice soft as she stared into the distance. Jake turned to her, considering the question. "Not often," he admitted. "I've always been more focused on what's right in front of me." Ayana smiled faintly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Maybe that's the way it's meant to be," she said quietly. "We can't change the past, and the future is never certain. All we can do is make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." Jake looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always focused on the now, on the survival of the moment, but Ayana was right. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. They had already chosen their path, and no matter what came, they would face it together. As the night settled in, the first stars appeared in the sky, twinkling like tiny beacons in the vastness of the world. The quiet of the night was broken only by the distant sound of coyotes howling, a reminder that the wilderness was never truly silent. But as Jake sat there beside Ayana, he felt a sense of peace settle in him, knowing that, for the first time in a long time, he was no longer alone in this fight. Together, they would face whatever the future held. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. Jake, Ayana, and Takota spent their time fortifying the ranch, securing the land, and making sure everything was in place. The Apache warriors remained ever watchful, their presence a constant reminder of the looming threat. Jake had grown used to the silence of his life, but now, that silence felt more like a ticking clock. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the air cooling with the evening breeze, Jake found himself reflecting on the days before all of this, before Ayana, before Takota, before the impending conflict. He had always preferred solitude, the simple life of a rancher, working the land and keeping to himself. But now, he understood that solitude could no longer protect him. It had never truly protected him. Ayana stood beside him one evening, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun had just set. Her presence was a quiet strength that seemed to anchor Jake in the midst of everything. He could sense her thoughts were far away, the weight of their shared future heavy in the air between them. "Do you think we can hold them off?" Jake asked, his voice low as he watched her. Ayana turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "We have to," she said simply. Her voice carried a calm that Jake could not quite understand, but in her eyes, he saw a fire, a determination to protect what was hers. "But do you believe we can?" Jake pressed, the uncertainty in his chest growing. Ayana took a deep breath, her gaze never wavering from the distance. "I believe we must," she said softly. "And sometimes that's all we have. Belief." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering her words. He had never been a man of belief, at least not in the way Ayanna was. To him, belief had always seemed like a luxury, something people turned to when they had nothing else. But now, standing beside her, he was beginning to see it differently. Maybe belief wasn't a luxury. Maybe it was the thing that kept people standing when everything else was falling apart. Dakota joined them, his presence as steady as always. "The riders will come," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "And when they do, we will be ready." Jake looked at Dakota, nodding in agreement. Dakota's words were simple, but there was an undeniable power in them. The Apache leader wasn't speaking of victory or defeat. He was speaking of survival, of standing firm in the face of whatever came. And that was enough for Jake. It had to be. The following days were tense, each one feeling longer than the last. Jake found himself unable to rest, his mind constantly running through the possibilities of what could happen. The wind seemed to whisper warnings, the earth beneath his feet trembling with anticipation. He had always prided himself on being prepared for the worst, but now, as the moment drew closer, he realized that no amount of preparation could have fully prepared him for this. Ayanna and Dakota were his allies now, but the cost of this alliance was something that weighed on him more with each passing day. He couldn't help but wonder if he was doing the right thing. Was he fighting for the right cause? Was he standing with the right people? But in his heart, Jake knew the answer. He had no choice. The fight was no longer about right or wrong. It was about survival. And when the time came, he would stand with them, no matter the cost. As dusk fell on the ranch one evening, the distant sound of hooves broke the stillness. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The riders were coming. Dakota's warriors were already in position, watching the horizon with keen eyes. Ayanna stepped up beside Jake, her gaze fixed on the approaching riders. There was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. "It's time," she said, her voice steady, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. Jake swallowed hard, his own nerves stirring within him, but he said nothing. He knew what had to be done. The riders grew closer, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing through the air like a warning. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. And as the first rider appeared on the horizon, Jake felt something inside him shift. There was no turning back now. No more waiting. No more wondering. It was time to face what was coming, and he was ready. They were ready. The riders were close now, their figures becoming more defined against the setting sun. Jake stood at the ready, his hand steady on his rifle, but his mind was sharp, alert to every movement around him. Ayanna and Dakota had positioned themselves beside him, both calm but focused, their eyes tracking the incoming riders with the same precision as a seasoned warrior. The ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with tension, and the air felt charged, as if the very land knew that a reckoning was coming. Jake glanced at Ayanna, her stance unwavering, her expression one of quiet determination. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had been there since he first met her. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, she was fighting for something much greater, something that had been threatened for too long. The first rider appeared on the ridge, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. He was followed by a group of men, their horses moving in unison, their presence a reminder that this fight was not just for land, it was a fight for the future. The wind carried the scent of dust and sweat, the scent of a battle that had been waiting to unfold. Dakota's warriors, positioned in the shadows, shifted slightly, ready for whatever came next. The leader of the riders, Jake recognized him immediately, was a man he had seen before, one of the settlers who had caused trouble in the past. He had the look of a man who had seen too many battles, and his eyes were hard, filled with the arrogance of someone who believed they were always in control. As the riders drew nearer, the tension grew palpable, but Dakota stepped forward, his movements deliberate, his voice calm but firm. "This land does not belong to you," he called out to the riders, his voice carrying over the distance between them. The riders slowed, and the leader of the group narrowed his eyes. "We've been through this before, Apache," he sneered. "This land is ours, and we will take it back, whether you like it or not." Jake could see the leader's hand resting on the hilt of his gun, but he didn't move. Instead, he waited, letting Takota's words hang in the air between them. Ayana stepped forward, her eyes locked with the leader's. "You have no right to take what doesn't belong to you," she said, her voice steady, filled with quiet power. The leader looked at her, his gaze flicking over her with a hint of recognition. "You're the one who caused all the trouble," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've got a lot of nerve standing here." Ayana didn't flinch. "We stand because this is our land," she replied, her words clear and resolute. The wind shifted again, the sun now fully set, leaving only the faintest glow on the horizon. The riders paused, as if weighing their next move, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The tension in the air was thick, a moment suspended in time, before the leader spoke again. "This isn't over," he said, his voice laced with menace. "We'll be back, and next time, we won't be leaving without what we came for." Takota's eyes hardened, but his voice remained calm. "You will not return," he said simply. "This land is protected by the Apache, and we will not let you take it from us." The leader of the riders sneered, but he didn't make a move. Instead, he turned his horse and signaled for the rest of the group to follow. As they rode away, Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The immediate threat had passed, but Jake knew this was far from over. The riders would return, and next time, they would be ready. Takota stood still for a moment, watching the riders disappear into the distance. "This fight is far from over," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But we have bought ourselves some time." Ayana nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "We must be ready," she said. "The next time they come, we will not hesitate." Jake looked between Ayana and Takota, feeling the weight of their words settle in his chest. This was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future, for the land they called home, and for everything they held dear. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't face it alone. Together, they would stand firm, no matter what the future held. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy calm. The riders had retreated, but their words lingered in the air, heavy with the promise of return. Jake Thompson, Ayana, and Takota spent their time reinforcing their positions, making sure the ranch was as secure as it could be. Takota's warriors remained vigilant, their eyes always scanning the horizon, their presence a constant reminder of the threat that still loomed. Jake, however, found himself torn. He had never been a man of many words, preferring the quiet life of a rancher. But standing alongside Ayana and Takota, he knew that the quiet life was no longer an option. As the sun began to set one evening, casting a warm golden glow over the land, Jake sat on the porch of his cabin, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had always found peace in the simplicity of nature, but tonight, the peace felt distant, almost unattainable. Ayana approached him silently, her footsteps barely audible on the dusty ground. She sat down beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together, watching the sunset, the silence between them speaking volumes. It was Ayana who broke the silence first. "Do you think we can hold them off?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a quiet intensity. Jake turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we have no choice but to try." Ayana nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "I've spent my life fighting for my people," she said, her voice steady. "But sometimes, I wonder if it's ever enough." Jake's gaze softened as he looked at her. He could hear the weariness in her voice, the weight of years spent in constant struggle. "Maybe it's not about being enough," he said slowly. "Maybe it's just about doing what you can, when you can." Ayana turned to him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "And what if it's still not enough?" she asked quietly. Jake took a deep breath, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. "Then we keep fighting," he said simply. "We fight because it's the only choice we have." There was a long pause, and Ayana seemed to consider his words. Finally she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I've never wanted this life," she admitted. I've never wanted to fight, to lose so much. But it feels like there's no way out. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. Sometimes, the only way out is through, he said softly. And we'll get through it together. The sound of hooves reached their ears, and both Jake and Ayanna turned toward the distant sound. Dakota appeared from the shadows, his face as calm and unreadable as ever. He had been a constant presence, the silent strength that held them all together. It's time, Dakota said simply, his voice steady. The riders are coming. We will face them. Jake stood, the weight of Dakota's words settling into him. He had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, he felt the full gravity of it. The time for waiting was over. He had always believed that he could protect his land, his people, but now he realized that protection wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Ayanna stood beside him, her eyes filled with the same determination that had driven her from the very beginning. We stand together, she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. And we fight for what's ours. Dakota's warriors gathered around them, their presence a powerful reminder of the strength that came from unity. Jake felt his own resolve harden as he looked at the men and women who had chosen to fight beside him. This wasn't just about defending a ranch. It was about defending a way of life, a future that was worth fighting for. As the sound of hooves grew louder, Jake felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something that had been threatened for far too long. And he would not back down. The riders were close now, but Jake, Ayanna, and Dakota stood ready. They would face whatever came next, together, no matter the cost.